Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the May 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Theses on Fundamental Tasks of the Second Congress of the Communist International by Lenin from 1920. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So this piece is a follow-up to the one that we recorded and posted most recently, Liberal and Marxist Conceptions of the Class Struggle by Lenin from 1913. But whereas that article was written prior to the outbreak of World War I and when the Russian revolutionary movement was finding its way back to strength during the period of counter-revolution and reaction which followed the earlier 1905 to 1907 period, this piece was written after some very significant developments. First, the outbreak of World War I, then the betrayal of the European working class by the Second Socialist International, led by figures like Karl Kautsky of Germany, then the Russian revolutionary success of late 1917 and the withdrawal of Russia from the war, and then the establishment of the Third Communist International, or the Comintern, to replace the opportunist Second International and to Bolshevize those parties which were willing to join it, and to reshape them according to principles which had proved victorious in the Russian Revolution, and to purge them of the influence as much as possible of the Second International and the Two and a Half International, which also sprang up. Other things happened during the 7-year period as well, but for the purposes of this article, that's what we want to focus on. Basically, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were saying to the other Marxist parties, we had a successful revolution, we now control a large amount of territory and have established a socialist camp versus the imperialist camp. You can either stay with the leadership of the Second International, which sold you out in the face of an inter-imperialist war, which should have been turned into a revolutionary war against imperialism, or you can join with us and help to build the thing which is more likely to be a vehicle for continuing to advance and develop the proletarian revolution. So for these parties, there were terms set, and we have already posted these on the channel. If you search on terms of admission into the Communist International, also from 1920, and I highly recommend that as a companion piece to this one. It is a list of things that the parties joining the Comintern had to do in order to be eligible for membership. Policies that they had to adopt, practices that they had to uphold, etc. Very interesting and very useful stuff. So turning our attention to the table of contents of this file, we see that there are 3 main sections. The first is the essence of the dictatorship of the proletariat and of Soviet power. The second is what immediate and universal preparation for the dictatorship of the proletariat should consist of. And third, rectification of the political line, and partly also the composition of the parties affiliated or desiring to affiliate to the Communist International. So really core important topics that Lenin and the Bolsheviks felt should be at the center of the reorganization of the revolutionary Marxist movement. So this piece was written 30 June 1920, first published in July 1920. The source is Lenin's Collected Works, 4th English edition, Progress Publishers, Moscow, 1965, volume 31, translated by Julius Katzer, HTML transcription and markup by David Walters and R. Simbala, and you can find it online at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Let's begin. 1. The present stage in the development of the international communist movement is marked by the fact that the finest representatives of the revolutionary proletariat in all capitalist countries have fully grasped the fundamental principles of the Communist International, viz., dictatorship of the proletariat and Soviet power, and have ranged themselves with unbounded enthusiasm on the side of the Communist International. An even bigger and more important step forward is the definite sympathy with these fundamental principles that has everywhere taken shape among the broadest masses, not only of the urban proletariat, but of the advanced or more class-conscious section of the rural workers as well. On the other hand, 2 errors or failings are to be observed in the very rapidly growing international communist movement. One, which is very grave and constitutes an immense and immediate danger to the success of the cause of proletarian emancipation, is that a section of the old leaders and the old parties of the Second International, some yielding half unconsciously to the wishes and pressure of the masses, and some deliberately deceiving the masses in order to retain their functions of agents and assistants of the bourgeoisie within the working class movement, declare their qualified or even unqualified adherence to the Third International while actually remaining in all their practical party and political work, on the level of the Second International. Such a state of affairs is absolutely intolerable because it leads to downright corruption of the masses, detracts from the Third International's prestige, and threatens a repetition of the same acts of treachery as were perpetrated by the Hungarian Social Democrats, who so hastily assumed the title of communists. And commenting, prior to 1917, the Marxist movement as a whole referred to itself as social democracy. However, by 1917, after the social chauvinism, or socialism in name, but nationalistic bourgeois warmongering in practice of some of the parties in the Second International, Lenin proposed that parties of the Bolshevik type split away and refer to themselves as communists, and leave the title of social democracy to those supposed socialists who, in times of an actual revolutionary crisis, would come to the aid of the capitalist class. So when Lenin says that the Hungarian Social Democrats hastily assumed the title of communists and then performed treacherous acts, actually betraying the revolution, he's saying that they needed to clarify the standards of who could call themselves a communist, who could be recognized as an actually trustworthy revolutionary, as much as you can establish that prior to, the rubber actually meeting the road in a revolutionary moment, in order to reduce the chances of getting backstabbed again. Continuing, the other error, which is far less significant and is more in the nature of growing pains of the movement, consists in a tendency toward ultra-leftism, which results in a wrong appraisal of the role and the tasks of the party with regard to the class and the masses, and a wrong attitude toward the revolutionary communists' obligation to work in bourgeois parliaments and reactionary trade unions. Comment, for more on that, see Lenin's book, Left-Wing Communism, left-wing being in quotes because this is actually ultra-leftism, or pseudo-leftism, an infantile disorder, which we have on the channel, and is also in a relevant playlist, which we recorded recently, titled Lenin on Petty Bourgeois Revolutionism. Continuing, communists are in duty bound not to gloss over shortcomings in their movement, but to criticize them openly so as to remedy them the more speedily and radically. For this purpose, it is necessary first to define as concretely as possible, particularly on the basis of the practical experience already acquired, the precise content of the immediate and systematic preparatory work to be carried on in all countries so as to give effect to these slogans, and third, to specify the methods and means of rectifying the faults in our movement. The essence of the dictatorship of the proletariat and of Soviet power. 2. The victory of socialism as the first stage of communism over capitalism requires that the proletariat, as the only really revolutionary class, shall accomplish the following three tasks. Comment regarding the stages of communism. Marx had used the terms socialism and communism interchangeably, but recognized that there was a lower stage where it was not as developed and a higher stage where it was more advanced and developed. In the 20th century, with the development of Marxism-Leninism, it became conventional to refer to the lower stage as socialism and to the more advanced stage as communism. Now, even at the peak of the 20th century wave of the communist movement, only about a third of the world's population was living in a country which was building socialism or which had established some kind of a dictatorship of the proletariat, and then eventually a round of counter-revolution and reaction sprang up and beat it back. So even at its peak, it was still a counterpower, and that higher stage of communism, full communism, has not been yet achieved. Continuing on to Lenin's three tasks for the proletariat regarding the initial victory of socialism as the first or lower stage of communism over capitalism. First, overthrow the exploiters, all the exploiting classes, and first and foremost the bourgeoisie or capitalists as the exploiters' principal economic and political representative. Utterly rout them. Crush their resistance. Absolutely preclude any attempt on their part to restore the yoke of capital and wage slavery, or capitalist employment. Second, win over and bring under the leadership of the Communist Party, the revolutionary vanguard of the proletariat, not only the entire proletariat or its vast majority, but all who labor and are exploited by capital. Educate, organize, train, and discipline them in the actual course of a supremely bold and ruthlessly firm struggle against the exploiters. Wrest this vast majority of the population in all the capitalist countries from dependence on the bourgeoisie. Imbue it, through its own practical experience, with confidence in the leading role of the proletariat and of its revolutionary vanguard. Third, neutralize or render harmless the inevitable vacillation between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, between bourgeois democracy and Soviet power, that will be seen in the class of petty proprietors or small businessmen in agriculture, industry, and commerce, a class which is still fairly numerous in nearly all advanced countries, although comprising only a minority of the population, as well as in the stratum of intellectuals, salary earners, etc., which corresponds to this class. The first and second tasks are independent ones, each requiring its own special methods of action with regard to the exploiters and the exploited, respectively. The third task follows from the first two, and merely requires a skillful, timely, and flexible combinations of methods of the first and second type, depending on the specific circumstances in each separate instance of vacillation. Comment: this is a really important point to understand. The petty bourgeoisie or small capitalist class, and even individuals who are actually members of another class but who have falsely acquired the consciousness of the small capitalist class, are vacillating. They are unreliable allies who on their own can't decide where to put their loyalty, with the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, so they go back and forth and don't have a consistent outlook. As Lenin says, this is why the first and second steps are important. Utterly rout the bourgeoisie, make them a completely ruined class that no one would want to side with. In other words, that there is clearly no future in hitching your political wagon to. Second, do provide a clear example of whom to follow by building up the knowledge, revolutionary confidence, and ability to carry out well-organized and planned revolutionary activity of the proletariat under the leadership of the communist vanguard. Now, even having made all of that as clear as you possibly can for the petty bourgeoisie, they're still going to vacillate, at least to some extent, so you got to be ready for that and be prepared to neutralize any ill effects of that before they really do damage. Continuing. Point 3. In the concrete situation created throughout the world, and above all in the most advanced, powerful, enlightened, and free capitalist countries, by militarism, imperialism, the oppression of colonies and weak countries, the worldwide imperialist butchery, and the quote-unquote Peace of Versailles, following World War I. In that situation, the very idea of the capitalists peacefully submitting to the will of the majority of the exploited, the very idea of a peaceful reformist transition to socialism, is not merely sheer Philistine stupidity, but also downright deception of the workers, embellishment of capitalist wage slavery, and concealment of the truth. That truth consists in the bourgeoisie, even the most enlightened and democratic, no longer hesitating at any fraud or crime, even the massacre of millions of workers and peasants, so as to preserve private ownership of the means of production. Comment: this was before fascism per se, fascism proper, fascism calling itself fascism, had emerged. This was 1920. However, Lenin is anticipating here, once the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, has seen a proletarian revolution which is threatening their entire order if it spreads, they will take the most desperate and violent actions in order to try to preserve capitalism. This is still the era in which we live, the era of imperialism, or fully matured and now overripe and decaying capitalism which has no more historical progress to add to the development of human society, and the beginning, but not the completion, of the proletarian revolution, now long delayed in the imperialist countries and even severely beaten back in those places where it had previously taken hold. For more on that, see the best book on fascism I'm aware of, Fascism and Social Revolution by Rajani Palm Dutt, which we have here on the channel as an audiobook. So basically what Lenin is saying here is that the concrete situation now, following the World War and the beginning of the era of proletarian revolution, is that no matter how peaceful or quote-unquote free, particularly the advanced capitalist countries may try to make themselves appear, and to be sure, we do want to advance civil rights as much as we can for the purpose of having a freer hand to wage the class struggle and pursue revolution. The reality is that the capitalists who run these countries will do anything to try to protect their order, their continued class rule, and to prevent revolution and the reforming of society around the interests of the workers. So the idea that you can peacefully transition to socialism using capitalist governments by electing more socialists is ridiculous. What the capitalists will do as soon as they feel sufficiently threatened is cancel democracy, call off elections, or do whatever they have to do with the elections, and replace the bourgeois democratic forms of capitalist government with new, openly terroristic forms of capitalist government, which we now colloquially know as fascism, even though they don't all call themselves fascism. But that is the basic phenomenon and the reasons for it. Continuing, only the forcible overthrow of the bourgeoisie, the confiscation of its property, the destruction of the entire bourgeois state apparatus from top to bottom, parliamentary, judicial, military, bureaucratic, administrative, municipal, etc., right down to the wholesale deportation or internment of the most dangerous and stubborn exploiters and the institution of strict surveillance over them so as to foil their inevitable attempts to resist and to restore capitalist slavery. Only such measures can ensure real submission of the whole class of exploiters. On the other hand, the idea, common among the old parties and the old leaders of the Second International, that the majority of the exploited toilers can achieve complete clarity of socialist consciousness and firm socialist convictions and character under capitalist slavery, under the yoke of the bourgeoisie, which assumes an infinite variety of forms that become more subtle and at the same time more brutal and ruthless the higher the cultural level in a given capitalist country, is also idealization of capitalism and of bourgeois democracy, as well as deception of the workers. In fact, it is only after the vanguard of the proletariat, supported by the whole or the majority of this, the only revolutionary class, overthrows the exploiters, suppresses them, emancipates the exploited from their state of slavery, and immediately improves their conditions of life at the expense of the expropriated capitalists. It is only after this, and only in the actual process of an acute class struggle, that the masses of the toilers and exploited can be educated, trained, and organized around the proletariat under whose influence and guidance they can get rid of the selfishness, disunity, vices, and weaknesses engendered by private property. Only then will they be converted into a free union of free workers. 4. Victory over capitalism calls for proper relations between the leading Communist Party, the only revolutionary class, the proletariat, and the masses, i.e. the entire body of the toilers and the exploited, including non-proletarian elements. Only the Communist Party, if it is really the vanguard of the revolutionary class, if it really comprises all the finest representatives of that class, if it consists of fully conscious and staunch communists who have been educated and steeled by the experience of a persistent revolutionary struggle, and if it has succeeded in linking itself inseparably with the whole life of its class, and through it with the whole mass of the exploited, and in completely winning the trust and confidence of this class and this mass, only such a party is capable of leading the proletariat in a final, most ruthless and decisive struggle against all the forces of capitalism. On the other hand, it is only under the leadership of such a party that the proletariat is capable of displaying the full might of its revolutionary onslaught, and of overcoming the inevitable apathy and occasional resistance of that small minority, the labor aristocracy, who have been corrupted by capitalism, the old trade union and cooperative leaders, etc. Only then will it be capable of displaying its full might, which, because of the very economic structure of capitalist society, is infinitely greater than its proportion of the population. Finally, it is only after they have been really emancipated from the yoke of the bourgeoisie and of the bourgeois machinery of state. Remember that the state is a product of class struggle, and every ruling class sets up its own state after tearing down the last one. So bourgeois machinery of state here referring to the capitalist class. Continuing, only after they have found an opportunity of organizing in their soviets or councils in a really free way, that is free from the exploiters, that the masses, i.e. the toilers and exploited as a body, can display for the first time in history all the initiative and energy of tens of millions of people who have been crushed by capitalism. Only when the Soviets have become the sole state apparatus is it really possible to ensure the participation in the work of administration of the entire mass of the exploited, who, even under the most enlightened and freest bourgeois democracy, have always actually been excluded 99% from participation in the work of administration. Because remember, in capitalist society, the capitalists control and direct all production and all of the policies related to that, basically anything of real importance where there's real power. Continuing, it is only in the Soviets that the exploited masses really begin to learn, not in books, but from their own practical experience, the work of socialist construction, of creating a new social discipline and a free union of free workers. What immediate and universal preparation for the dictatorship of the proletariat should consist of. 5. The present stage in the development of the international communist movement is marked by the fact that in the vast majority of capitalist countries, the proletariat's preparations to effect its dictatorship have not been completed, and in many cases have not even been systematically begun. From this, it does not, however, follow that the proletarian revolution is impossible in the immediate future. It is perfectly possible, since the entire economic and political situation is most inflammable and abounds in causes of a sudden flare-up. The other condition for revolution, apart from the proletariat's preparedness, viz. A general state of crisis in all the ruling and in all capitalist parties, also exists. However, it does follow that the Communist Party's current task consists not in accelerating the revolution, but in intensifying the preparation of the proletariat. On the other hand, the facts cited above from the history of many socialist parties make it incumbent on us to see that recognition, in quotes, of the dictatorship of the proletariat shall not remain a mere matter of words. Hence, from the point of view of the international proletarian movement, it is the Communist Party's principal task at the present moment to unite the scattered communist forces, to form a single communist party in every country, or to reinforce or renovate the already existing party, in order to increase tenfold the work of preparing the proletariat for the conquest of political power. Political power, moreover, in the form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Comment: when we say dictatorship here, we mean the class rule of the proletariat, not just electing more quote-unquote socialists to the capitalist government. Continuing, the ordinary socialist work conducted by groups and parties which recognize the dictatorship of the proletariat has by no means undergone that fundamental reorganization, that fundamental renovation, which is essential before this work can be considered communist work, and adequate to the tasks to be accomplished on the eve of proletarian dictatorship. 6. The proletariat's conquest of political power does not put a stop to its class struggle against the bourgeoisie. On the contrary, it renders that struggle most widespread, intense, and ruthless. So, commenting, there is debate sometimes, not sure why, but there's debate about whether class struggle ends or intensifies following the beginning of the building of socialism. There is Lenin's answer on that question. Continuing, owing to the extreme intensification of the struggle, all groups, parties, and leaders in the working class movement who have fully or partly adopted the stand of reformism, of the quote-unquote center, etc., inevitably stand with the bourgeoisie or join the waverers, or else, what's most dangerous of all, land in the ranks of the unreliable friends of the victorious proletariat. Hence, preparation for the dictatorship of the proletariat calls not only for an intensification of the struggle against reformist and quote-unquote centrist tendencies, but also for a change in the character of that struggle. The struggle cannot be restricted to explaining the erroneousness of these tendencies. It must unswervingly and ruthlessly expose any leader of the working class movement who reveals such tendencies, for otherwise the proletariat cannot know who it will march with into the decisive struggle against the bourgeoisie. This struggle is such that at any moment it may, and actually does, as experience has shown, substitute criticism with weapons for the weapon of criticism. Any inconsistency or weakness in exposing those who show themselves to be reformists or quote-unquote centrists means directly increasing the danger of the power of the proletariat being overthrown by the bourgeoisie, which tomorrow will utilize for the counter-revolution that which short-sighted people today merely see as quote-unquote theoretical difference. Comment, this is why we have done a number of videos recently criticizing Bernie Sanders, and there will be others. Continuing. 7. In particular, we must not restrict ourselves to the usual repudiation in principle of all collaboration between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, of all quote-unquote collaborationism. Under the dictatorship of the proletariat, which will never be able at one stroke to abolish private property completely, mere defense of quote liberty and quote equality, while private ownership of the means of production is preserved, turns into collaboration with the bourgeoisie, and undermines the rule of the working class. The dictatorship of the proletariat means that the state uses its whole machinery of power to uphold and perpetuate no liberty for the exploiters to continue their oppression and exploitation, inequality between the owner of property, which is to say one who has appropriated for themselves certain means of production which were created by social labor, and the non-owner. That which, prior to the victory of the proletariat, seems merely a theoretical difference on the question of quote-unquote democracy, inevitably becomes, on the day following victory, a question that is settled by force of arms. Consequently, even preliminary work in preparing the masses to effect the dictatorship of the proletariat is impossible without a radical change in the entire character of the struggle against the quote-unquote centrists and the quote-unquote champions of democracy. Comment, because as Lenin said, you're not going to be able to socialize all bourgeois property immediately, so some amount of private bourgeois property is going to remain for some period of time. And to be clear, the revolution will socialize as much of the critical and largest infrastructure as it can immediately, but some of the medium-sized and smaller bourgeois enterprises won't be able to be socialized until later. So while those vestiges of capitalism continue to linger, what you need is a political climate which holds their owners in contempt. So as far as the general principles of liberty, equality, free speech, things like that, you must be prepared to deny them in a revolutionary situation to the former capitalists, because if you don't, you're basically collaborating with them and helping them to try to pursue their class interests again. The whole point of this is to exterminate that class as a class, which doesn't mean killing every last individual who has engaged in that behavior, but making that behavior illegal and suppressing its return until such time as socialism has been built, where the world has actually moved on and that desire to return to capitalism would not gain an inch of traction. But that's not the case right after the revolution and at the very beginning of socialism. The capitalists will try to reinstitute capitalism, and if you give them equal rights, it means denying those rights to your class, because they want to go back to a class society. They want to go back to one class of people having rights over others. We are pushing on into the future where everyone is of the same class. Continuing, 8. The dictatorship of the proletariat is the most determined and revolutionary form of the proletariat's class struggle against the bourgeoisie. This struggle can be successful only when the most revolutionary vanguard of the proletariat has the backing of the overwhelming majority of the proletariat. Hence, preparation for the dictatorship of the proletariat entails not only explanation of the bourgeois character of all reformism, of all defense of democracy in the abstract while private ownership of the means of production is preserved, which ends up being democracy for the capitalists and not so much for everyone else. It entails not only exposure of such trends, which are in fact a defense of the bourgeoisie within the labor movement. It also calls for old leaders being replaced by communists in proletarian organizations of absolutely every type, not only political but also trade union, cooperative, educational, etc. The more complete, lengthy, and firmly established the rule of bourgeois democracy has been in a given country, the more the bourgeoisie will have succeeded in securing the appointment to such leading posts of people whose minds have been molded by it and imbued with its, the bourgeoisie's, views and prejudices, and who have very often been directly or indirectly bought by it. These representatives of the labor aristocracy, which is to say those trade unions that don't want an end to capitalism but just sort of like fair pay for certain deserving workers and also a preservation of imperialism abroad, or as Lenin said, continuing, bourgeoisified workers, should be ousted from all their posts 100 times more sweepingly than hitherto. In other words, pick up the pace, and replaced by workers, even by wholly inexperienced workers, provided that they are connected with the exploited masses and enjoy their confidence in the struggle against the exploiters. The dictatorship of the proletariat will require the appointment of such inexperienced workers to the most responsible posts in the state. Otherwise, the workers' government will be impotent and it will not have the support of the masses. Comment, in other words, forget bourgeois respectability and experience. What counts here is rallying the proletarians politically for a resolute struggle against the outgoing capitalist order. Continuing, 9. The dictatorship of the proletariat means that all toiling and exploited people who have been disunited, deceived, intimidated, oppressed, downtrodden, and crushed by the capitalist class, come under the full leadership of the only class trained for that leadership by the whole history of capitalism. That is why the following is one of the methods whereby preparations for the dictatorship of the proletariat should be started everywhere and immediately. In all organizations, unions, and associations without exception, and first and foremost in proletarian organizations, but also in those of the non-proletarian toiling and exploited masses, like, say, a peasantry, and this includes political, trade union, military, cooperative, educational, sports, etc., groups or cells of communists should be formed. Preferably open groups, but underground groups as well, the latter being essential whenever there is reason to expect their suppression or the arrest or banishment of their members on the part of the bourgeoisie. These cells, which are to be in close touch with one another and with the party center, should, by pooling their experience, carrying on work of agitation, propaganda, and organization, adapting themselves to absolutely every sphere of public life and to every variety and category of the toiling masses, systematically educate themselves, the party, the class, and the masses by means of such diversified work. In this connection, it is of the utmost importance that necessary distinctions between the methods of work should be evolved in practice. On the one hand, in relation to the, quote, leaders or responsible representatives who are very often hopelessly beset with petty bourgeois and imperialist prejudices, such, quote, leaders must be ruthlessly exposed and expelled from the working class movement. And on the other hand, in relation to the masses, who, particularly after the imperialist Holocaust, are for the most part inclined to listen to and accept the doctrine that the guidance from the proletariat is essential as the only way of escape from capitalist slavery. We must learn to approach the masses with particular patience and caution so as to be able to understand the distinctive features in the mentality of each stratum, calling, etc. of these masses. Comment: when I tell people at the end of so many videos to get involved with your local left, take what you've learned here at the channel and in your other communist studies and apply that in the decisions and questions that come up for a vote in whatever organizations you become involved in, and just to get to know people and to get to know how the organizations work, etc., this is exactly what I'm talking about. Building the knowledge, the understanding, and the presence to expel, as the struggle goes along, exactly the kind of tainted leadership that Lenin is describing here. Continuing. 10. In particular, there is a group or cell of communists that deserves exceptional attention and care from the party, i.e. the parliamentary group of party members, who are deputies to bourgeois representative institutions, primarily the national but also local, municipal, etc. representative institutions, or elected government. On the one hand, it is this tribune which is held in particular regard by large sections of the toiling masses, who are backward or imbued with petty bourgeois prejudices. It is therefore imperative for communists to utilize this tribune to conduct propaganda, agitation, and organizational work, and to explain to the masses why the dispersal of the bourgeois parliament by the National Congress of Soviets was legitimate in Russia, and at the proper time will be legitimate in any country. On the other hand, the entire history of bourgeois democracy, particularly in the advanced countries, has converted the parliamentary rostrum into one of the principal, if not the principal, venues of unparalleled fraudulency, financial and political deception of the people, careerism, hypocrisy, and oppression of the working people. The intense hatred of parliaments felt by the best representatives of the revolutionary proletariat is therefore quite justified. So commenting, Lenin's not done here yet, but I just want to point out that Lenin is saying here that those communists who actually serve as elected representatives, who actually run for office and things like that, need special care from the party. Why is that? Well, those with more class consciousness will recognize that the capitalist governments are really nothing but forums for exploiting the working class, where different factions of the capitalist class come together to basically agree on how they're going to go about that. But at the same time, those with less class consciousness, who are still caught up in capitalist illusions, are likely to look up to elected government officials, and so the communists therefore have to try to use this the best that we can. By electing our own representatives from our own parties, though, is a very important clarification that goes back to Marx and Engels, the entire history of Marxism. We do not just tail bourgeois parties, for example, in the US, the Democratic Party. So there is a tension there between the more class-conscious communists who probably want nothing to do with the capitalist government and the actual need to engage in these institutions in order to reach those potential future allies who currently have a low level of class consciousness and consequently respect capitalist government offices, and use those positions of authority to agitate, educate, and organize along the lines of actual revolutionary work like explaining why Russia had to get rid of its capitalist government and so on. Continuing, the communist parties and all parties affiliated to the Third International, especially those which have not arisen by splitting away from the old parties and by waging a long and persistent struggle against them, but through the old parties accepting, often nominally, the new stand, should therefore adopt a most strict attitude toward their parliamentary groups. The latter must be brought under the full control and direction of the central committees of the parties. They must consist in the main of revolutionary workers. Speeches by members of parliament should be carefully analyzed in the party press and at party meetings from a strictly communist standpoint. Deputies should be sent to carry on agitational work among the masses. Those who manifest Second International leanings, reformism, opportunism toward the capitalist parties, counter-revolutionary tendencies, should be expelled from the parliamentary groups, etc. Commenting, so just to emphasize, Lenin said that the groups of communists sent by the parties to parliament are playing an important role which needs to be scrutinized carefully, especially in those parties which are not new communist parties or didn't break away as a revolutionary splinter from a revisionist party of the Second International type, reformist, opportunist, counter-revolutionary. Because some of the parties from the Second International did try to join the Comintern, and Lenin was saying, you're saying you're adopting these new positions, you might just be trying to stay relevant, but actually have no intention of adopting and conforming to real revolutionary principles, which this international is trying to establish. So because of the particularly important and very public role of the specifically parliamentary group of these parties or any parties, an extra I needs to be placed on them. Continuing. 11. One of the chief causes hampering the revolutionary working class movement in the developed capitalist countries is the fact that because of their colonial possessions and the super profits gained by finance capital, etc., and commenting super profits are profits above and beyond what the capitalists get from exploiting the domestic working class internal to the country, but rather from exploitation abroad. Continuing, the capitalists of these countries have been able to create a relatively larger and more stable labor aristocracy, a section which comprises a small minority of the working class. This minority enjoys better terms of employment and is most imbued with a narrow-minded craft spirit and with petty bourgeois and imperialist prejudices. Comment, note that Lenin correctly describes this group as a small minority. What he's talking about is, for example, in the US, the AFL, which was always one of the most reactionary trade union federations, played a role in upholding capitalism by elevating a certain type of white male breadwinner, which was the basis of the sort of deserving worker who got the representation and the better wages. Meanwhile, when more radical labor unions emerged, the AFL would actually scab against them when they went on strike, or they would break their strikes. When Lenin describes them as having a narrow-minded craft spirit, it means that rather than some of the unions like the IWW, or later the CIO, which organized along industrial lines or organizing the whole industry together regardless of what specific job people did, this kind of craft spirit is more of like, oh, I'm this super skilled person and I'm so deserving and blah, blah, blah. It's not deep solidarity across the entire working class. Continuing, it forms the real social pillar of the Second International, of the reformists and the, quote, centrists. At present, it might even be called the social mainstay of the bourgeoisie. No preparation of the proletariat for the overthrow of the bourgeoisie is possible, even in the preliminary sense, unless an immediate, systematic, extensive, and open struggle is waged against this stratum, which, as experience has already fully shown, will no doubt provide the bourgeois white guards, white is the color of the counter-revolutionary army, with many a recruit after the victory of the proletariat. All parties affiliated to the Third International must at all costs give effect to the slogans, deeper into the thick of the masses, closer links with the masses, meaning by the masses all those who toil and are exploited by capital, particularly those who are least organized and educated, who are most oppressed and least amenable to organization. The proletariat becomes revolutionary only insofar as it does not restrict itself to the narrow framework of craft interests, only when in all matters and spheres of public life it acts as the leader of all the toiling and exploited masses. It cannot achieve its dictatorship unless it is prepared and able to make the greatest sacrifices for the sake of victory over the bourgeoisie. In this respect, the experience of Russia is significant both in principle and in practice. The proletariat could not have achieved its dictatorship there, or won the universally acknowledged respect and confidence of all the toiling masses, had it not made the most sacrifices, or starved more than any other section of those masses, at the most crucial moments of the onslaught, war, and blockade effected by the world bourgeoisie. In particular, the Communist Party and all advanced proletarians must give all-round and unstinted support especially to the spontaneous and mass strike movement, which under the yoke of capital is alone capable of really rousing, educating, and organizing the masses, of imbuing them with complete confidence in the leadership of the revolutionary proletariat. Without such preparation, no dictatorship of the proletariat is possible. Those who are capable of publicly opposing strikes, such as Kautsky in Germany and Turati in Italy, cannot possibly be tolerated in the ranks of parties affiliated to the Third International. This applies even more, of course, to those trade union and parliamentary leaders who so often betray the workers by using the experience of strikes to teach them reformism and not revolution, for instance in Britain and in France in recent years. 12. In all countries, even in those that are freest, most, quote, legal, and most peaceful in the sense that the class struggle is least acute there, it is now absolutely indispensable for every communist party to systematically combine legal and illegal work, legal and illegal organizations. And commenting, this is to be contrasted with the liquidationist trend, which Lenin fought within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party prior to the revolution, which sought to completely eliminate the illegal wing of the struggle. Not surprisingly, the liquidationists were a wing of the Menshevik reformist faction. Continuing, notwithstanding their false and hypocritical declarations, the governments of even the most enlightened and freest of countries, where the bourgeois democratic system is most quote-unquote stable, are already systematically and secretly drawing up blacklists of communists and constantly violating their own constitutions so as to give secret or semi-secret encouragement to the White Guards and to the murder of communists in all countries, making secret preparations for the arrest of communists, planting agents provocateurs among the communists, etc., etc. Only a most reactionary Philistine, no matter what cloak of fine, quote, democratic and pacifist phrases they may don, will deny this fact, or the conclusion that of necessity follows from it, viz. That all legal communist parties must immediately form illegal organizations for the systematic conduct of illegal work, and for complete preparations for the moment the bourgeoisie resorts to persecution. Illegal work is most necessary in the army, the navy, and the police, because, since the imperialist Holocaust, governments the world over have begun to stand in dread of people's armies, which are open to the workers and peasants, and are secretly resorting to all kinds of methods to set up military units specially recruited from the bourgeoisie and equipped with the most up-to-date weapons. On the other hand, it is likewise necessary that, in all cases without exception, the parties should not restrict themselves to illegal work, but should conduct legal work as well, overcoming all obstacles, starting legal publications, and forming legal organizations under the most varied names, which should be frequently changed if necessary. This is being practiced by the illegal communist parties in Finland, Hungary, partly in Germany, Poland, Latvia, etc. It should be practiced by the industrial workers of the world in the USA, the IWW labor union I just mentioned, and by all communist parties at present legal, should public prosecutors see fit, to take proceedings against them on the grounds of resolutions adopted by Congresses of the Communist International, etc. A combination of illegal and legal work is an absolute principle dictated not only by all features of the present period, that of the eve of the proletarian dictatorship, but also by the necessity of proving to the bourgeoisie that there is not, nor can there be, any sphere of activity that cannot be won by the communists. Above all, it is dictated by the fact that broad strata of the proletariat, and even broader strata of the non-proletarian, toiling, and exploited masses still exist everywhere, who continue to believe in bourgeois democratic legality, and whom we must undeceive without fail. 13. In particular, the conditions of the working-class press in most advanced capitalist countries strikingly reveal the utter fraudulency of liberty and equality under bourgeois democracy, as well as the necessity of systematically combining legal work with illegal work. Both in vanquished Germany and in victorious America, the entire power of the bourgeoisie's machinery of state and all the machinations of the financial magnates are employed to deprive workers of their press, these including legal proceedings, the arrest or murder by hired assassins of editors, denial of mailing privileges, the cutting off of paper supplies, and so on and so forth. Besides, the news services essential to daily newspapers are run by bourgeois telegraph agencies, while advertisements, without which a large newspaper cannot pay its way, depend on the goodwill of the capitalists. To sum up, through skullduggery and the pressure of capital and the bourgeois state, the bourgeoisie is depriving the revolutionary proletariat of its press. To combat this, the communist parties must create a new type of periodical press for mass distribution among the workers. First, legal publications, which, without calling themselves communist and without publicizing their links with the party, must learn to make use of any legal opportunity, however slight, just as the Bolsheviks did under the Tsar after 1905. Secondly, illegal leaflets, even the briefest and published at irregular intervals, but reprinted at numerous print shops by workers, secretly, or if the movement has become strong enough, by the revolutionary seizure of print shops, and providing the proletariat with outspoken revolutionary information and revolutionary slogans. Preparations for the dictatorship of the proletariat are impossible without a revolutionary struggle, into which the masses are drawn for the freedom of the communist press. Rectification of the political line, and partly also of the composition of parties affiliated or desiring to affiliate to the Communist International. 14. The measure in which the proletariat in countries most important from the viewpoint of world economics and politics is prepared to establish its dictatorship can be seen with the greatest objectivity and precision in the fact that the most influential parties of the Second International, viz. The French Socialist Party, the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, the Independent Labour Party of Great Britain, and the Socialist Party of America, have withdrawn from this yellow international. Comment: yellow in this context refers to something which has capitalist sympathies. For example, a yellow union is a union which is basically run by management. Continuing, and have decided, the first three conditionally, the latter even unconditionally, to affiliate to the Third International. This proves that not only the vanguard of the revolutionary proletariat, but its majority, too, have begun to come over to our side, convinced by the entire course of events. The main thing now is the ability to consummate this process, and to consolidate firmly in point of organization what has been achieved, so as to advance all along the line without the slightest wavering. And there's a footnote here. The American Socialist Party was formed in July 1901 at a Congress held in Indianapolis, as the result of a merger of groups that had broken away from the Socialist Workers' Party and the Social Democratic Party of the USA. Among the new party's organizers was Eugene Debs, a popular figure in the U.S. labor movement. The social composition of the party was not uniform. It contained native-born and immigrant workers, as well as small farmers and people of petty bourgeois origin. The centrist and the right-wing opportunist leaders of the party, including Victor Berger, Morris Hillquit, and others, denied the necessity of the proletarian dictatorship, renounced revolutionary methods of struggle, and reduced all party activities to participation in election campaigns. During the First World War, 1914-18, three trends appeared in the Socialist Party. The social chauvinists, who supported the imperialist policy of the administration, the centrists, who opposed the imperialist war only in word, and the revolutionary minority, who took an internationalist stand and struggled against the war. The Socialist Party's left wing, headed by Charles Ruthenberg, William Foster, William Haywood, and others, relying on the proletarian elements, waged a struggle against the party's opportunist leadership for independent proletarian action and the formation of industrial trade unions based on the principles of the class struggle. In 1919, a split took place in the Socialist Party. The party's left wing broke away, becoming the initiator and nucleus of the Communist Party of the USA. At present, the Socialist Party is a small sectarian organization. Back to the main text. 15. All the activities of the parties mentioned, to which should be added the Socialist Party of Switzerland, if the Telegraph reports of its decision to join the Third International are true, show, as any periodical of these parties will strikingly confirm, that they are not yet communist and quite often run directly counter to the fundamental principles of the Third International, viz. The recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat and Soviet government in place of bourgeois democracy. Accordingly, the Second Congress of the Communist International must resolve that it cannot immediately accept the affiliation of these parties, that it endorses the reply given by the Executive Committee of the Third International to the German, quote, independence, that it confirms its readiness to conduct negotiations with any party that withdraws from the Second International and desires to enter into closer relations with the Third International, that it will admit the delegates of such parties in a deliberative capacity to all its congresses and conferences, that it sets the following conditions for the complete adhesion of these and similar parties with the Communist International. 1. All decisions of all congresses of the Communist International and of its executive committee are to be published in all the periodicals of the parties concerned. 2. These decisions are to be discussed at special meetings of all sections or local organizations of the parties. 3. After such discussions, special congresses of the parties are to be convened to sum up the results, and for the purpose of 4. Purging the parties of elements that continue to act in the spirit of the Second International. 5. All periodical publications of the parties are to be placed under exclusively communist editorship. The Second Congress of the Third International should instruct its executive committee formally to accept these and similar parties into the Third International after ascertaining that all these conditions have actually been met and that the activities of the parties have assumed a communist character. Quick footnote there on the Social Democratic Party of Switzerland, also known as the Swiss Socialist Party. It was formed in the 1870s of the last century and affiliated to the First International. The party was reformed in 1888. The opportunists were very influential in the party and during the First World War took a social chauvinist stand. In the autumn of 1916, the party's right wing broke away to form their own organization. The majority, headed by Robert Grimm, took a centrist, social pacifist stand, while the left wing of the party adhered to an internationalist stand. The Great October Socialist Revolution in Russia influenced and strengthened the left wing, which, in December 1920, broke away and joined the Communist Party of Switzerland in 1921. Back to the main text. 16. As to the question of the conduct of communists now holding a minority of the responsible posts in these and similar parties, the Second Congress of the Communist International should resolve that, in view of the obvious growth of sincere sympathy for communism among working people belonging to these parties, it would be undesirable for communists to resign from the latter, as long as they can carry on work within them for the recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat and Soviet government, and as long as it is possible to criticize the opportunists and centrists who still remain in these parties. At the same time, the Second Congress of the Third International should declare in favor of communist groups and organizations, or groups and organizations sympathizing with communism, joining the Labour Party in Great Britain, despite its membership in the Second International. As long as this party ensures its affiliated organizations their present freedom of criticism and freedom to carry on work of propaganda, agitation, and organization in favor of the dictatorship of the proletariat and Soviet government, and as long as this party preserves the character of a federation of all trade union organizations of the working class, it is imperative for communists to do everything and to make certain compromises in order to be able to exercise their influence on the broadest masses of the workers, to expose their opportunist leaders from a higher tribune that is in fuller view of the masses, and to hasten the transfer of political power from the direct representatives of the bourgeoisie to the, quote, labor lieutenants of the capitalist class, so that the masses may be more quickly weaned away from their last illusions on this score. 17. Concerning the Socialist Party of Italy, the Second Congress of the Third International considers that the criticism of that party and the practical proposals submitted to the National Council of the Socialist Party of Italy in the name of the party's Turin section, as set forth in L'Ordine Nuovo of May 8, 1920, are in the main correct and are fully in keeping with the fundamental principles of the Third International. Footnote there, the Turin section accused the Italian Socialist Party, with its conciliatory leadership, of failing to give a correct analysis of events in the conditions of the revolutionary upsurge in Italy, 1919 to 1920, that had created the possibility of the seizure of political power by the proletariat, and of having failed to advance any slogan acceptable to the revolutionary masses, and expel the reformists from its ranks. The section made a number of practical proposals: the expulsion of the opportunists from the party, the formation of communist groups in each factory, in the trade unions, cooperatives, and army barracks, the setting up of factory trade union committees to organize control of production in industry and agriculture. The section demanded that work to prepare the working masses for the creation of Soviets should be begun at once. Commenting, so basically, at the end of World War I, in Italy, there had been a revolutionary moment, as there had been in several other countries, including Russia, which was successful, and Germany, which was not successful. Also Hungary, which was briefly successful, then failed. But in Italy, what you had was a revolutionary moment, which the Revolutionary Party, ostensibly Revolutionary Party, just let pass by without stepping up. Hence the subsequent criticisms. Back to the main text. Accordingly, the Second Congress of the Third International requests the Socialist Party of Italy to convene a special Congress to discuss these proposals and also all the decisions of the two Congresses of the Communist International for the purpose of rectifying the party's line and of purging it, particularly its parliamentary group, of non-communist elements. 18. The Second Congress of the Third International considers erroneous the views on the party's relation to the class and to the masses, and the view that it is not obligatory for communist parties to participate in bourgeois parliaments and in reactionary trade unions. These views have been refuted in detail in special decisions of the present Congress and advocated most fully by the Communist Workers' Party of Germany and partly by the Communist Party of Switzerland, by Communismus, organ of the East European Secretariat of the Communist International in Vienna, by the now dissolved Secretariat in Amsterdam, by several Dutch comrades, by several communist organizations in Great Britain, as for example the Workers' Socialist Federation, etc., and also by the Industrial Workers of the World in the USA, and the Shop Stewards Committees in Great Britain, etc. Nevertheless, the Second Congress of the Third International considers it possible and desirable that those of the above-mentioned organizations which have not yet officially affiliated to the Communist International should do so immediately. For in the present instance, particularly as regards the Industrial Workers of the World in the USA and Australia, as well as the Shop Stewards Committees in Great Britain, we are dealing with a profoundly proletarian and mass movement, which in all essentials actually stands by the basic principles of the Communist International. The erroneous views held by these organizations regarding participation in bourgeois parliaments can be explained not so much by the influence of elements coming from the bourgeoisie, who bring their essentially petty bourgeois views into the movement, views such as anarchists often hold, as by the political inexperience of proletarians who are quite revolutionary and connected with the masses. For this reason, the Second Congress of the Third International requests all communist organizations and groups in the Anglo-Saxon countries, even if the Industrial Workers of the World and the Shop Stewards Committees do not immediately affiliate to the Third International, to pursue a very friendly policy toward these organizations. to establish closer contacts with them and the masses that sympathize with them, and to explain to them in a friendly spirit, on the basis of the experience of all revolutions, and particularly of the 3 Russian revolutions of the 20th century, the erroneousness of their views as set forth above, and not to desist from further efforts to amalgamate with these organizations to form a single communist party. 19. In this connection, the Congress draws the attention of all comrades, particularly in the Latin and Anglo-Saxon countries, to the fact that since the war, a profound ideological division has been taking place among anarchists all over the world regarding the attitude to be adopted towards the dictatorship of the proletariat and Soviet government. Moreover, a proper understanding of these principles is particularly to be seen among proletarian elements that have often been impelled toward anarchism by a perfectly legitimate hatred of the opportunism and reformism of the parties of the Second International. That understanding is growing the more widespread among them, the more familiar they become with the experience of Russia, Finland, Hungary, Latvia, Poland, and Germany. The Congress therefore considers it the duty of all communists to do everything to help all proletarian mass elements to abandon anarchism and come over to the side of the Third International. The Congress points out that the measure in which genuinely communist parties succeed in winning mass proletarian elements rather than intellectual and petty bourgeois elements away from anarchism is a criterion of the success of those parties. July 4, 1920. And that is the end of the audiobook. So I've given my more specific comments during the text. I think overall this is a great text as a kind of introduction to what was going on as the era of proletarian revolutions was kicking off, and what Lenin and the Bolsheviks were trying to establish in terms of a baseline for the international communist movement moving forward, raising the bar and bringing new parties into the fold, people who wanted to leave the old Second International opportunist ways behind, and to contribute to the actually revolutionary wing of the movement, what really could be called the only true wing of the movement. So in that spirit of the kind of onboarding that this document was geared toward, I have tried with my comments to orient them to explaining any terms that might be unfamiliar, so that people who are newer to the channel and newer to communism in general could actually use this text as kind of a jumping off point. So hopefully that was helpful. Otherwise, what do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We will continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and thanks to the current patrons and Buy Me a Coffee supporters whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. Every donation is encouraging, they're also materially helpful, and they allow me to spend more time on this channel than I'd be able to do without them. This is also a purely viewer-funded channel, as we don't run ads, so that support is important. If you like this channel, find it helpful, thank me of course, but also thank a patron or Buy Me a Coffee supporter, and consider becoming one yourself. Beyond that, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe. That will help others to stumble across this channel and be helped by it. As Lenin said in this text, the Communist Party's current task consists not in accelerating the revolution, but in intensifying the preparation of the proletariat to unite the scattered communist forces and form a single communist party in every country, or to reinforce or renovate the already existing party. Now, this opens up a whole other side discussion which doesn't fit neatly into a closing speech, is a difficult topic when it comes to the USA, because right now the CPUSA, the sort of official old Comintern party, in 2025 will straight up tell you to vote for the Democratic Party, and an attempt at last year's national convention to address some of the revisionism, deep revisionism going on in that party was not successful. And as there are several such parties, it's like, which one do you even pick to renovate and, try to reconstitute the party? I think that there's a broader discussion that has to happen around that as more people become literate in Marxism-Leninism. So for now, keep studying and we will push on. Remember that we can agitate and educate easily online, but organizing happens in real life. I would encourage people, if they're not willing to get into a communist party which is doing liberalism at the moment and struggle to change that party, at least get involved in your local left. Find some local organizations that you can participate in, network with other comrades, find out about projects that might not be publicly advertised, and overall intensify the class struggle in your area. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.